This video is a record of 2 January sessions at Bury Marsh, a venue that Lock, Stock and Tackle kindly put me onto. Personally, I prefer to fish the eastern side of Southampton Water, with Westfield Common being the venue I'm most familiar with. However, when there's a strong wind from the south or southwest, and you want a comfortable day's fishing with a wind from behind, it's best to head to the western side of Southampton Water. A number of locals will head for Magazine Lane in these conditions, but here, at Bury Marsh, you've got the option of being able to cast into the deeper water as well as the shallow mudflats. And since it's January and I like to fish for flatfish, I'm here fishing the shallower water trying to catch flounders. If that doesn't work out and I don't get any bites there, I've still got the option to be able to cast into the main channel, so I'm setting up my second rod with this in mind. The map shows the location of some of Southampton Water's better known marks and then zooms in on where Bury Marsh is found. Magazine Lane is at the northern end of Marchwood, and beyond this is Bury Marsh itself. On the River Test, directly opposite Southampton's container port at Gate 20. So, if there's not much happening with the fishing, there's plenty to see directly opposite with dockside activity, if that's your sort of thing. I'm here to catch though, so out goes a 3-hook clip down rig, having first walked to the end of the point to get that extra distance to chuck into the main channel. The other rod has already been cast onto the mudflats to the left. Since this is the first time I fished here, I wasn't sure whether the point I'm standing on gets covered in water at high tide, but since this is a neap tide, I needn't have worried. However, I did leave all my gear up on the bank well behind me, just in case. I also should have realised that I should have got here earlier, having missed the first of the high tides, and I'm starting fishing as the tide is going down, not quite the ebb, but a state between the 2 high tides. So I'm leaving my rod bag and rucksack on the mound behind me and just taking down my bucket seat and cool bag down to where I'm fishing. This point protects the marsh to the left and Bury Creek to my right, and as you can see, it's made up of rocks in cages, so it's not natural and quite difficult to walk on. The wire mesh also presents a few challenges with wide sinkers and your hook lengths, with hooks quite often getting stuck in the wire. By the time I'm ready to focus on my rods, the tide is already coming in for the second high tide, and I'll get my first bite. This is over the shallow water of the mudflats, and the bite was very similar to the ones I was getting at Weston, so in my haste I struck at it. I now sort of regret that, because that's the only flounder bite I had of the session. Whether it would have developed or not is anyone's guess, but who knows. At least it's given me hope that there is some signs of life there, and I'm thinking I'm unlikely to blank now. The worms are still okay though, so I'm quickly casting back into what I think is the same spot. Since the wind is from the south, it's going from right to left in this view, and it's not as strong as it was predicted, so I've got the shelter here, as well as the wind's not being that strong. In other words, pretty much ideal conditions for fishing. I'm now also getting small indications on the right hand rod. This is the one that I've chucked into the main channel. Since the bites were so delicate and I couldn't strike into one of those, I've now swapped over to the short wire boom rig. See if that makes any difference. My second bite in the shallow water is a decent pull round, but unfortunately I miss it. I don't feel the fish, so I'm just leaving it. Another little twitch, so I move a rod to see if I could tease the fish into a proper bite. That seemed to work. This looks a lot more confident. I feel the fish on, but frustratingly there's nothing there. Worm on the lower snood has been chewed though, so needs replacing. As you can see, the rig is a 3-hook, long snood, flapper rig. Since I'm using stop knots, I've got the option to be able to lower the bottom snood and to make it a 2-up, 1-down rig. Next bite is to the short wire boom rig fished in the channel. Not what I wanted. A tiny little scaldy bass. Now that's more like it. A proper pull round on my other rod, and line has been taken off the spool, so I have to tighten the drag before winding in. And I can feel it's a fairly decent fish. It's not very often that I set the drag, but as luck would have it, this is one time when it was needed. Since the water is very shallow here, the fish is putting up a fair amount of resistance and needs to be played. Then I feel it snagged me. A few gentle pulls, but with fine gear and size 4 hooks, I fear I might be able to lose this. So I lower the rod and release the pressure. And try moving it again. I still feel in contact with the fish, but I'm not gaining much ground. I still feel the fish on, but it's stuck in what I think is a weed bed. Since I don't want to lose it, I'm moving to apply pressure from a different angle. That idea has worked and the fish is free of a snag. I beach it rather than lift it, as a hook might pull out. Not a flounder, but I'll gladly settle for one of these. It's hooked a little bit inside the mouth, so needs to be disgorged. I like to use plastic disgorgers if at all possible, since I think it's a lot kinder on the fish. Since the action seems to be better in the shallow water, both rods have now been cast there. This second rod is a little bit further out though, towards the channel, but definitely not in it. I've changed the rig over from the boom rig to another 3-hook long snood flapper, and as you can see the lower snood has been pulled down to make it a 2-up 1-down rig. The bait used for the whole of this session has just been ragworm. The tide is now properly ebbing and the bite frequency is increasing. But it's back to small schoolies. So, despite the lack of flounders, it's still an enjoyable session, and I end up with 6 bass to over £2. 2 weeks later, and I'm back in the same spot, still trying to catch a flounder. So, this time, I'm starting with both of my rods being cast straight into that shallow water. So both have 3-hook flapper rigs and continental weights. I think this one's called an Americano. If you're using light hook lengths, then long snoods present a few problems, particularly with line twist, and I find that this tends to take place closer to the swivel. So before fishing, and quite often during fishing, I spend quite a bit of time unravelling the line. Once again, I'm just using quality ragworm obtained from Lock, Stock and Tackle. I'm using smaller worms to create a small bunch on the hook, as you would with maddies. I've got here a bit earlier and have arrived just before the top of the first high tide, and although it's still a neap tide, being 2 weeks after my previous session, as you can see, it seems to be a much higher tide. This time the point may well get submerged, and I'd imagine it would do on a spring tide. At the moment the wind is from the southeast, and I really should be over the other side of Southampton Water, somewhere like Weston, but since I was convinced I had a flounder bite at the start of the last session, I was determined to try and catch one. Crabs weren't a problem here last time, but I still like to move the rigs just to give a bit of movement to the bait, which might attract a flounder. Typical, last time I left half my gear on a mound behind me. This time I've brought it all down with me, and I'm slightly regretting that now. as the water rises, I'm not sure whether the whole of this point is going to get swamped. So I'm moving some of my gear a little bit further back. I think there's enough gear still left in the bucket seat to prevent it from floating off. As I've mentioned before, when the action is slow, there's still a lot to see. And boats of this size, because they move so slowly, they don't actually create a wake, so your gear is not going to get swamped. It's a slow start, without any bites, over the first high water. No signs in the shallow water, so as it starts to ebb between the two high tide states, I decide to chuck it a bit further out, not right into the channel, but further towards it. That produces a bite, but I don't connect. Having left it for a second go, and the result is the same. I did think that I felt a fish on, but it seems to have come off. However, next cast to the same spot and are finally connecting to one. Not a schoolie, but a whiting. Closer in, and the schoolies start feeding. This one's on the top snood. Try one of my techniques I use at Southend for hitting schoolie bites, and that is slowly dragging the bait after you've had a couple of little knocks, and it seems to work here as well. It's small, it's not a flounder, but it's a fish. Anyway, I've given it a go. It's slow. I've not caught my target species. I have caught no flounders, 4 bass and 2 whiting. Better than being stuck indoors watching the television.